There was a time when Europe, China, Persia, and the great kingdoms of Asia knew little about the people living beyond the northern frontier. They were horsemen. They lived beneath an enormous sky. They moved with the seasons. They had no great cities, no marble palaces, no massive standing army. And yet, within a few decades, these people would shake the foundations of the medieval world. They would conquer kingdoms that had existed for centuries. They would defeat armies many times larger than their own. And they would create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At the center of it all was one man, but he was not born a king. He was not born into a palace. And he did not inherit a powerful empire. He began life as a boy named Temujin. His father was murdered. His family was abandoned. His own people turned against them. Temujin was hunted, imprisoned, betrayed, and forced to survive in one of the harshest environments on earth. Yet somehow, that boy survived. And over the course of a lifetime, he would transform himself from an abandoned child into the ruler known to history as Genghis Khan. This is the story of how it happened. To understand Temujin, we first have to understand the world into which he was born. In the 12th century, the Mongolian steppe was a vast ocean of grass stretching across northern Asia. There were no permanent borders dividing the land into modern countries. There were no highways, no cities connected by roads. Instead, the landscape was dominated by enormous open plains, mountains, rivers, deserts, and endless grasslands. For the people who lived there, survival depended on movement. The Mongol tribes raised horses, sheep, goats, cattle, camels, and other animals. Horses were especially important. A horse was transportation. A horse was food. A horse was wealth. And in war, a horse could mean the difference between life and death. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they were old enough. A Mongol warrior could travel enormous distances on horseback. He could hunt while riding. He could shoot about from the saddle. And he could survive for long periods with very little food. But the steppe was not an easy place to live. Winters could be brutal. Food supplies could disappear. Animals could die. Tribes competed for pasture and water. And when resources became scarce, neighboring groups could quickly become enemies. The Mongolian steppe was divided among many tribes and clans. Among them were the Mongols, Tatars, Kurid, Naiman, Merkit, and others. They fought, they traded, they formed alliances, and they betrayed one another. Political power depended heavily on personal relationships. A strong leader could unite hundreds or even thousands of warriors. But when that leader died, the alliance could collapse. This was the world Temujin was born into, a world where loyalty was valuable. But loyalty could also disappear overnight. Around the middle of the 12th century, a boy was born to Yasuge, a powerful Mongol chieftain. His name was Temujin. According to the traditional accounts, his father was returning from a conflict when he encountered a group of Tatars. Yasuge had defeated a Tatar warrior named Temujin Uj. The child was then given the name Temujin. Whether every detail of this traditional story can be independently verified is uncertain, but what is clear is that Temujin was born into a family with status among the Mongol tribes. His father was a respected leader. His mother, Hulan, was strong, intelligent, and determined. And for a few years, Temujin's childhood appeared to be heading toward a traditional life of tribal leadership. But that future would collapse suddenly. When Temujin was still a child, his father was poisoned by enemies. Yasuge was dying, and the political protection of his family died with him. Temujin was too young to command warriors. His brothers were too young. His mother could not simply inherit her husband's followers. The family's enemies saw weakness, and they acted. After Yasuge's death, many of his followers abandoned the family. The steppe had little room for weakness. The men who had once followed Yasuge had no reason to remain loyal to a widow and several children, so they left. Hulan was left with her children and almost nothing. The family had to survive without the protection of a powerful clan. They were forced to gather whatever food they could find. They collected roots, they caught fish, they hunted small animals, they gathered berries and wild plants. The family survived through determination rather than wealth. Imagine the difference. One moment, Temujin was the son of a tribal leader. The next, he was a child struggling to survive with his family. This experience would shape him permanently. He learned something that would later become one of the central ideas of his rule. Power could disappear. A man could have followers today and be abandoned tomorrow. Status meant nothing if people were unwilling to stand beside you, and loyalty had to be earned. But survival was not always peaceful. Temujin's family was divided by internal tensions. His older half-brother, Better, had authority within the family. Temujin and his younger brother Khazar eventually killed Better. The exact circumstances remain debated, but the incident reveals something important about Temujin's childhood. He was growing up in an environment where survival could become brutally personal. There were no police, no courts in the modern sense, no government coming to protect a weak family. The family had to protect itself, and Temujin was learning how to do exactly that. Temujin's troubles did not end with poverty. As he grew older, he became a target. At one point, he was captured by members of the Taiki Yudi tribe. They placed a wooden kang around his neck and held him prisoner. He was still young. He had no army, no kingdom, no great political power. He was simply Temujin, a captive. But even in captivity, he refused to accept his fate. Eventually, he escaped. The details of his escape have been preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, one of the most important sources for his early life. The story describes how he found help from people who were willing to risk themselves for him. This matters because Temujin was beginning to discover something that would become central to his future success. People were willing to help him, not because he was already powerful, but because they believed in him. That distinction would become extremely important. Temujin would later build his empire not only through fear, but through relationships with people who believed that serving him could change their own lives. Temujin's life was about to change again. When he was still young, his father had arranged a marriage between him and a girl named Bord. Bord belonged to the Ungurette people. Marriage among steppe tribes was not simply about romance. It was politics. It created alliances. It connected families. And it could provide protection. Temujin eventually married Bord. For a short time, this gave him an important personal and political relationship. But the steppe was never peaceful for long. Bord was later captured by the Merkid. This was a devastating blow. Temujin did not have enough power to simply march out and recover her himself. So he turned to an older alliance. He sought the help of Tokrul, the powerful leader of the Creed. He also approached Jamaka, a childhood companion who would become one of the most important figures in Temujin's early life. Together, they launched a campaign against the Merkid. Bort was rescued, and Temujin's political world began to expand. He was no longer simply a struggling young man. He was becoming a leader. But another relationship was becoming even more complicated. His friendship with Jamaka would eventually become a struggle for the future of the Mongol steppe. Temujin and Jamaka had known each other from childhood. They had sworn a traditional bond of brotherhood known as Anda. And Anda was more than an ordinary friend. It was a sacred relationship of loyalty. At first, the two men were close. They lived together. They hunted together. They fought together. But eventually, their visions began to separate. Jamaka represented one style of steppe politics. Traditional tribal hierarchy was extremely important. Power belonged to established aristocratic families. Lineage mattered. Status mattered. The old tribal structure mattered. Temujin was different. He had experienced abandonment. He had watched people leave his family because his father was dead. He had seen how quickly traditional loyalty could disappear, and he began building something different. He gathered people around personal loyalty rather than simply tribal ancestry. A warrior could rise through ability. A man from a lower status background could become important if he proved himself. Temujin increasingly rewarded loyalty and competence. This threatened the traditional order, because if people could gain power through ability rather than birth, the old aristocracy could lose control. And slowly, the two former brothers began moving toward confrontation. Temujin's greatest achievement was not simply winning battles, it was convincing people to follow him. At first, his following was small, but his reputation grew. He treated some followers differently from traditional steppe leaders. Instead of dividing everything strictly according to tribal status, he increasingly organized his followers according to loyalty and military usefulness. This created opportunities for men who might otherwise have remained ordinary warriors. Men such as Bohoshin and Jilma became important companions. Others joined him because they believed he could provide security. Some joined because they were impressed by his leadership. Others joined because they had become enemies of rival tribes. Whatever their reasons, the result was the same. Temujin's group grew, and every new follower gave him more power. More power allowed him to attract more followers. A cycle began. The young leader who once had almost nothing was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But Temujin was not the only ambitious leader. Jamaka had his own supporters. The relationship between the two men eventually collapsed. Their followers began separating. The traditional leaders of the steppe were increasingly concerned about Temujin's growing influence. Eventually, Jamaka and his allies opposed him. Conflict followed. Temujin suffered defeats, but defeat did not destroy him. Instead, he learned. He adapted, and each conflict taught him more about how the tribes worked. The steppe was becoming a political battlefield. Every tribe had enemies. Every alliance had conditions. Every leader was watching the balance of power. Temujin realized that if he wanted to survive, he could not remain one tribal leader among many. He needed to unite the tribes, and that meant defeating the people who wanted to keep the old system intact. One of Temujin's major enemies was the Tatars. The Tatars had long been rivals of the Mongols. Their conflict with Temujin was also personal. His father had been poisoned by Tatars. Years later, Temujin joined forces with the Jin dynasty of northern China against them. This alliance was politically useful. The Jin wanted to weaken the nomadic groups on their northern frontier. Temujin wanted to eliminate dangerous rivals. Their interests temporarily aligned. The Tatars were defeated, but Temujin did not simply return to the old tribal system after victory. He continued building centralized power. The old tribal divisions were becoming less important. The people following him were increasingly reorganized into a larger political and military structure. This was the beginning of something revolutionary. Temujin was no longer simply trying to survive. He was trying to transform the entire steppe. Another major power was the Karit, led by Tokrul. Tokrul had once been an important ally of Temujin. Their relationship was complicated. At different times, they supported each other. But as Temujin became stronger, Tokrul increasingly saw him as a rival. This was a dangerous situation. Tokrul controlled a powerful tribal confederation. Temujin was still building his own. Eventually, their relationship broke down completely. Temujin attacked. The Karyot were defeated. One of the largest political powers on the steppe had fallen, and Temujin absorbed many of their people into his growing realm. But there was still one great rival, Jamaka, the man who had once been his closest friend. Jamaka represented the old order. Temujin represented something new. Their conflict was therefore more than a personal rivalry. It was a struggle over what Mongol society would become. Jamaka gathered supporters from the traditional aristocracy. Temujin continued attracting ordinary warriors and leaders who had risen through ability and loyalty. Eventually, the two sides came into direct conflict again. Jamaka's forces captured some of Temujin's men. According to traditional accounts, Jamaka responded with brutal punishment. Temujin was horrified. The story may contain elements shaped by later tradition, but it reflects an important contrast between the two leaders. Temujin increasingly emphasized loyalty and military merit. Jamaka remained connected to aristocratic tradition. Their rivalry was approaching its final stage. The Naiman were among the last major powers standing between Temujin and control of the Mongolian steppe. They were powerful, they had their own political traditions, and they were determined to resist Temujin. But Temujin had learned from years of warfare. He understood mobility, he understood intelligence, he understood deception, and, most importantly, he understood his enemy. His forces defeated the Naiman. With their defeat, one of the final major obstacles to Temujin's dominance disappeared. The balance of power had changed. The tribes that had once controlled the steppe independently were now being absorbed into one growing political system. Temujin was no longer the abandoned son of Yesoge. He was becoming the most powerful man in Mongolia, but he still needed one final step: recognition. In the year 1206, a great assembly was held on the Mongolian steppe. It was called a Kurultai. Leaders and representatives gathered. The rival tribes had been defeated or absorbed. The steppe was finally moving toward political unity under one ruler, and there, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of the title remains debated by historians, but its significance was enormous. Temujin had achieved what generations of steppe leaders had failed to accomplish. He had united the Mongol tribes, but this was not the end of his story. It was the beginning. Because Genghis Khan did not intend to stop at Mongolia. He had spent his childhood learning what weakness meant. He had watched his family abandoned. He had lived through hunger. He had been captured. He had fought rivals. He had watched alliances collapse, and every experience had taught him the same lesson: survival belonged to those who could adapt. Now he had an entire nation behind him, and that nation was built for war. Genghis Khan began restructuring the society he now controlled. The old tribal divisions were deliberately weakened. Instead of allowing every tribe to remain a separate political unit, he reorganized people into new military and administrative structures. This reduced the ability of traditional tribal leaders to rebel independently. A man's loyalty was increasingly directed toward the Khan in the new Mongol state. The military was organized in decimal units, groups of 10, hundreds, thousands, and larger formations. This system made it easier to mobilize large armies. Genghis Khan also rewarded people who demonstrated loyalty and ability. A warrior's future did not have to depend entirely on his birth. This was one reason talented commanders could rise rapidly. The Mongol state was becoming more centralized, more disciplined, and more dangerous. But military organization was only part of the transformation. Genghis Khan also understood the value of information. He needed messengers. He needed scouts. He needed intelligence. He needed to know where his enemies were before they knew where he was. These systems would later become crucial to Mongol warfare, but there was something even more important: communication. Across the vast steppe, orders had to move quickly. The Mongols developed systems of mounted messengers that could carry information across enormous distances. The empire that was coming would depend on speed, and speed would become one of the Mongols' greatest weapons. By now, the Puni de Machine Dispien and displaced to Genghis Khan, but who was a man himself. Later there are reasons why this got them in different ways. To some, he was Unster, a destroyer responsible for Imam's death and dispersion. To others, he was a brilliant military commander and political genius. The truth is more complicated. Genghis Khan was capable of extraordinary violence. His conquests caused catastrophic destruction in many cities and regions, but he was also a highly strategic ruler. He understood that terror could be used as a weapon. He understood that defeated enemies could be absorbed rather than always destroyed. He promoted talented individuals. He built systems of communication. He organized his military with remarkable efficiency, and he created political structures that survived beyond his own lifetime. His rise was not simply the result of being a great warrior. It was the result of understanding people, understanding fear, understanding loyalty, understanding geography, and understanding the weaknesses of divided enemies. So how did an abandoned child become Genghis Khan? There was no single answer. It was a combination of circumstances. His childhood taught him survival. His family taught him resilience. His enemies taught him caution. His alliances taught him politics. His defeats taught him adaptation, and his victories gave him confidence. But perhaps the most important lesson came from the moment his father's followers abandoned his family. Temujin learned that power based only on tradition was fragile. A tribe might follow you today and abandon you tomorrow. So he built something different, a system where loyalty was rewarded, where talent could rise, where warriors could gain wealth and status through service, and where the Khan stood at the center. This created a powerful bond. For the first time, many steppe warriors were not simply fighting for their tribe. They were fighting for a larger political identity. The Mongols. In 1206, when Genghis Khan was proclaimed ruler of the Mongols, the great civilizations of the world did not yet understand what had happened. To the south was China. To the west were the powerful Islamic states of Central Asia and Persia. To the north and west were the lands of the Turkic and other steppe peoples. Farther west was Europe. These regions contained enormous cities, rich agricultural lands, established governments, large armies, ancient cultures. Compared with them, the Mongols seemed like a small nomadic power living at the edge of civilization. But appearances were deceiving. The Mongols possessed something their enemies often struggled to match: mobility, discipline, intelligence, adaptability, and a willingness to fight across enormous distances. The boy who once searched for food on the steppe now commanded a united people, and he was about to turn outward. Genghis Khan's first major targets were not chosen randomly. He needed wealth, he needed resources, he needed secure borders, and he wanted to eliminate potential threats. The Mongols would first challenge powerful states around them. Then the scale of their campaigns would increase. Cities would fall, armies would disappear, trade routes would come under Mongol control, and territories thousands of kilometers from Mongolia would eventually become part of the expanding empire. But none of that would have been possible without the transformation that happened first. The transformation of the tribes, the transformation of the army, and the transformation of one boy, Temujin. Think about where the story began. A child. A father murdered, a family abandoned, a mother trying to keep her children alive, a boy hunting and gathering food, a prisoner with a wooden collar, a young man searching for allies, a husband whose wife was taken, a friend who became an enemy, a warrior who repeatedly lost and returned, and finally, a leader standing before the tribes of Mongolia, Genghis Khan. His transformation was extraordinary, but perhaps the most interesting part is that he did not become powerful because life was easy. He became powerful because life was not easy. Every crisis forced him to adapt. Every betrayal taught him something. Every enemy made him stronger. Every victory gave him another opportunity. And eventually, the man who had once been almost powerless created a state capable of challenging the greatest civilizations of his age. But the story was only beginning. In the year 1206, the Mongolian steppe was united. For the first time, a single ruler commanded a large and organized Mongol force. Genghis Khan had accomplished what seemed almost impossible. He had taken tribes that had spent generations fighting one another and turned them into one nation. But unity was not the final goal. It was the foundation. Beyond the Mongolian steppe lay enormous kingdoms: China, Central Asia, Persia, Russia, and eventually the lands of Eastern Europe. Genghis Khan was about to unleash an army unlike anything the medieval world had seen. An army that could travel hundreds of kilometers with incredible speed. An army whose warriors could shoot from horseback. An army that used intelligence and deception as carefully as swords and arrows. An army that could appear on one horizon and disappear before its enemies could respond. The world had not yet learned to fear the Mongols, but it soon would, because the boy who had once been abandoned by his father's followers was now the Khan, and the next chapter would begin with horses, thousands of them, racing across the steppe. This was the beginning of the Mongol Empire, and the storm was coming.